Okay, welcome everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Mason White. I'm the chair of the Events and Public Programming Committee at the John H. Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape and Design at the University of Toronto. And it's my honor to welcome you all to this afternoon's event, Constructing a Revisionist Architectural History of the Americas, an Architectural History Colloquium. First, however, I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Daniels honors Indigenous peoples past, present, and future here and around the world, and we wish to pay respect to local elders, including those of the lands from which you are joining us virtually today. While we recognize that not everyone is sharing the same space during this time, we encourage each of you to take the time to think about, learn, and reflect upon where you are and the Indigenous peoples who have lived there, are currently there, and the future generations who will live there. As people living on this land, it's essential for us to reflect the ethos and respect that the Indigenous community show towards the land and towards each other. We must show support through our actions, not just our words. And now I'd like to introduce Mary Lou Lobsinger, Associate Professor and Architectural Historian, who is leading today's event. Mary Lou, I pass it over to you.
Hello. Thank you, Mason. Thank you very much for the acknowledgement. I welcome everyone to this event today, and I especially thank my colleague Mason White, who gave me the opportunity to gather some people to talk about this very significant topic now today, and to thank the collaborators as we begin. This colloquium and this statement I'm reading was prepared by the guests, so I'm reading their statement. This colloquium invites you to consider the ways that recent histories of whiteness, settler colonialism, racial capitalism, and building labor propel us toward a more equitable architectural history of the Americas. These frames provide new ways of seeing the structural forces that condition the canonical histories of nation building traditions published from the early 19th century to today, and from the cultural norms of white elites that were concretized in the rules and standards of professional organizations, to the exclusive racial portraits of architectural genius that subtend our understanding of who is most responsible for the heights and complexities of Western civilization. Such frames enable us to better assess the blatant omissions, erasures, and biases that were perpetuated by the early 20th century historiographers, from the early histories Fiske Kimball to the modern and postmodern musings of William Jordy and Vincent Scully, a record that continues to haunt architectural history today. It is my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today's event and to extend gratitude for the immense contribution that they've put into putting this together. I would begin with Professor Charles L. Davis II, an assistant professor of architectural history and criticism at the University of Buffalo. His academic research excavates the role of racial identity and race thinking in architectural history and contemporary design culture. His current book project, tentatively entitled Black by Design, An Interdisciplinary History of Making in Modern America, recovers the overlooked contributions of Black artists and architects in shaping the built environment, from the Harlem Renaissance to Black Lives Matter. He has published articles and essays in Architectural Research Quarterly, Journal of Architectural, the Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians, Harvard Design Magazine, Log, Aggregate, Appendix, and VIA. The second speaker for today will be Brian Norwood. Professor Norwood, there he is, is an assistant professor, excuse me. Professor Norwood is an assistant professor of architecture and a postdoctoral fellow in the Michigan Society of Fellows at University of Michigan. His research focuses on architecture and building practices in the United States in the 19th century. Brian is currently currently working on two projects. The first, Architectural Calling, Protestantism, Nationalism, and Racecraft in the Formation of an American Profession, examines how the professionalization of architectural practice in the United States in the 1830s to the 1860s was intertwined issues of theology, racecraft, class, and historical consciousness. The second book is a study of the built environment's role in shaping memory in the US South from the Reconstruction to the New Deal. Our third speaker today will be Caitlyn Blanchfield. She is a PhD candidate in architectural history at Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, where she also received an MS in critical, curatorial, and conceptual practice in architecture. Caitlyn is a founding editor of the Avery Review, and her recent book, Modern Management Methods, Architectural Historical Value, and the Electromagnetic Image, was co-authored with Farzin Loftijam, was published by Columbia Books on Architecture and the City in 2019. Her writing has appeared in the Avery Review, Art Forum, New Geographies, Log, and elsewhere, and her work has been shown in the Oslo Architectural Triennale, the Venice Architectural Biennale, Akademisches Schloss Solitude, and The Shed. She's currently working on her dissertation, which examines architectures of settler colonialism and anti-colonialism refusal in North America, with a focus on contested landscapes of modern scientific research facilities. So that's the introduction. We'll begin with Charles. We'll have time for question and a Q&A session when the presentations are finished. So we can go to Charles now. Share screen.
Okay, thank you very much, Mary Lou, and everyone for this very generous introduction. I wanted to share just a brief 10-minute summary of what I'd like to talk about with you today, and then we will come back together and speak as a group. But the reading that I shared with you all, just to consider and to think about, really looks at the ways that the racial discourses of American architecture were beginning to migrate across the United States into the Midwest, particularly as we were seeing the completion of the International Railroad and the types of modernist cultures, modernist architectural cultures that were emerging in that space. Today, I want to talk to you about the ways that that kind of culture shifted even more as we saw it migrate over to the West Coast. And as we were looking at the ways that American culture was contemplating itself towards the closing of the American frontier, according to Turner's thesis of the same name. So I want to talk about this notion of performativity in the 19th century, particularly as it played itself out in the architect Bernard Maybach's architecture in northern Berkeley in Southern California. Here's an image of Charles and Louise Keeler. Charles Keeler was someone who was a popularizer of Maybach's theories. He was also someone who was the president of the Hillside Club around UC Berkeley as it was emerging. And the two of them really worked to both shape that community itself of migrating elites from the East Coast, but also to make a provisional argument about what American character should be like as people were moving to the West, and as we were thinking about what the relationship of the United States was within the Western civilizational project. And so I'm going to use the lens of performativity to think about the ways that both Maybach and his clients were able to literally reaffirm their identity as white ethnic citizens and subjects of American imperialism. You can see on the left here, I'm looking at Bernard Maybach posing with his family, literally as a form of play acting in the neighborhood. They did this personally themselves, and this was a common practice among the artists within Northern Berkeley. But then also at the Hillside Club, as you can see in the next slide, there were performances of plays such as The Mikado, which would instantiate a particular view of the Asian immigrant population that was coming into the West Coast, both in terms of borrowing of their cultural pedigree and cultural material culture, but then at the same time, as is common within American history, the denigrating of that community as being other and not being central to the mission of what American character would become. Maybeck, in turn, as an architect, worked on theater designs. And so you see some of that in the third slide here, third image rather here. And then on the very far right, I'm going to make a speculation as to how this notion of theatricality and performativity, both conceptually and professionally, plays itself out in the way that Maybeck references, makes certain aesthetic references to construct what I'm looking at as a kind of domestic sphere, where the white subject can literally perform their role as a citizen subject within the United States. Now, all this is taking place within a context when the United States as a continental unit is fully complete, and we're seeing the migration of the US into protectorates in the Pacific Ocean. And during this time period, there is real debate as to whether the United States should remain on the continent or whether its actual scope extends from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean in a kind of imperialism that would parallel the status and the reach of other European colonies and colonial empires. And this is an important thing to remember because there are two discourses happening at the same time. One is this domestic argument of how it is that the US is to think of itself as a nation, contained within the continent or spreading its wings across the different oceans. And then secondarily, there's a civilizational narrative that many are making. One way of understanding this is to think of the fact that the University of California at Berkeley was referred to as the Athens of the West. It was part of a Western civilizational project that was migrating its way westward across the globe. And as we got to the west coast of the United States, it would soon migrate now across the Pacific back home to Europe. And so as a cultural project and a US domestic political project, we're getting the sense, and we should get the sense, that Americans are trying to define who they are on the world stage and what is the extent of, at least in the terms that I'm examining here, whiteness in these spaces. And so I'm using the works of Linda Martine Alcoff and Sarah Ahmed, both of whom are phenomenologists who think about race not just in terms of it being an institutional and structural order within American politics, but also as a form of habit making, a form of habituation of space, and the ways that we as Black and white subjects inhabit space tell us what it means to be a racialized subject. And so I'm trying to bring these two forces together, the institutional at the geographical level and political level, and then the personal at the domestic level, to show how Maybeck as an architect is really mitigating and negotiating these two forces in his work. We should keep in mind that in the backdrop of what it means to be American, and in this case, during the time period, the late 19th century, what it means to be Anglo-American, or what whiteness means in the US. We're also thinking about the ways that non-white subjects, such as the Chinese laborers who are coming into the West Coast, both to work and because of certain political strategies, to never become citizens, full citizens of the United States, what this means in terms of maintaining and policing the boundaries of whiteness during this time period. We know from Maybeck's letters that he actually had personal knowledge of what this meant for Chinese Americans, Korean Americans, Filipinos in his archive. Here's an example on the right of an excerpt from a letter that he received from a friend telling him what it was like to serve as an overseer on a fruit plantation in the Hawaiian Islands that was overseeing different populations of Asian migrants, some of whom were from, as I mentioned, the Philippines, but then some of whom, the Japanese, Chinese, Korean, etc., but then some of whom were also from the Hawaiian Islands. And so this idea of the white I guess you call them the plantation manager, overseeing the populations of these new form of laborers. In one sense, as a continuation of what we know as plantation labor in the American South, but in another sense, the migration of cheap labor throughout the U.S. History, which would take its form in other episodes in the form of coolie labor. And it's really interesting against the backdrop of this, the way that the play acting within the Hillside Club becomes a factor. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the Concord people of Northern Berkeley, starting with someone like Keeler, and here he is with some of the other intellectuals of his day, mostly naturalists, essayists, moralists, people who were interested in elevating the public taste of those living around Northern Berkeley. And the key text that I use in this part of my research is The Simple Home, or The Simple House, by Charles Keeler. And this is an essay that he would use and write for the Hillside Club, both to perpetuate Maybeck's ideas aesthetically for the Northern Berkeley community of elites that would live there when it was just a kind of open field before urbanization hemmed in that territory, but also as a way of trying to translate for the West Coast collectively what this ethos might mean for establishing a unique idiom of modern architecture in this region. And tantamount to this are some of the activities of the Hillside Club. And so here is an image of what that club looked like on the right side, 1906 reconstruction. And then on the left side, just to give you a sense of its reach and influence in the region, I'm showing you some of the headlines that were attributed to the Hillside Club throughout the late 19th, early 20th century. And what's interesting is that you'll see them being covered for creating shows, curios on so-called Oriental cultures, on artistic performances of plays, as well as on lectures, some of which Maybeck himself would lead, helping people to understand what the culture of Asians was and what its relevance was to the growth of American letters and ideas. They would substantiate this in the form of a school, and you can see here in this clip in the middle, Maybeck's part of the art committee that invited this lecture on Oriental curios. And in addition to talking about Orientalism in terms of the broader geographical notion of it, starting in the far east of Asia, there was also a sense that Hawaiian culture was somehow a localized idiom of this network of ideas. But what I think is most interesting about the activities of this group is that part of its theory of beautification, both from the home and into the region itself through urban efforts of beautification, came in the form of prohibitions. And here's an article on the left talking about their fight against the establishment of laundries and other commercial enterprises in the Pretty Villa section of the city, alongside political cartoons satirizing the so-called productivity of the other or the non-native subject, while so-called real Americans, real citizens, are left out of work. And so this old trope within the WASP of the immigrant coming in and stealing the jobs of Americans. And I think that this creates a really interesting dilemma within Maybeck's work, because he, like Frank Lloyd Wright and some others, makes explicit references and incorporates the motifs of non-Western so-called Oriental cultures into their work. But so at a visual level, there seems to be an effort to synthesize the so-called Western and non-Western idioms within American practice. But at the level of space, at the level of where the client and their guests performed their identity and their Americanness, there was a clear segregation of these elements. And so this leads to and contributes to what I call an aesthetic imperialism within American architecture. This notion of the architect's ability to culturally appropriate the visual motifs of non-Western subjects, but to alienate those actual subjects from experiencing and benefiting from this practice, not even being looked upon as native informants or experts within the space, but being subject to completely a kind of geometrical abstraction of that work, so that the Western architect, the European settler architect, can appropriate that and use that for their own public spaces, personal spaces. And so I'm trying to show how the patterns of thinking emerge from the domestic sphere into the theatrical sphere, and then into the larger geometrical thinking of the region. Here are just a few images to give you a sense of historically the way that this would play itself out. I did show this image on the right before. On the left here, we see another performance at another grove, local grove, Bohemian Grove, to which Maybeck was a part, showing the dressing of white European Americans as a form of natives, so a form of red face and yellow face that occurred in this region. And Maybeck himself would personally design the sets for the performance of the Mikado itself. And so here's a newspaper, again within the WASP, testifying to that. But here's a letter specifically by Maybeck to the Bishop Playhouse, talking about the ways that light and lighting effects can help to amplify the meaning of the play. And so he would be hired specifically to do this for the Mikado at certain elements. And what's interesting then is that we'll see some of this theatricality come into play in the way that he develops his own work, particularly in the unique way he translates architectural precedents into material form. The last bit of evidence I want to show you is a trip that he took to Hawaii itself on the SS Wilhelmina. And if you look at the testimonies inside of his personal writings and personal papers, this one written by W.B.R. Wilcox, a travel companion of his, you see that he and many others on the ship would perform in this kind of black face, brown face, yellow face in these theatrical performances that took places during the cruise over. And then when he finally arrived, he would make note of some of the local customs of Hawaiian vernacular architectures, particularly the lanai, or the green space in front of that their dwellings, their local dwellings. And he would use this knowledge to then create his own work. And so for me, Maybeck's own style is theatrical in a couple of really interesting ways. One is that he attempts to capture the cultural spirit of the homeowner. And this usually is a white cultural elite in the space. He never designed a space for an Asian American or Hawaiian client. He tries to mine these historical precedents for the emotional affect on the viewer, not just their material details. And this is very different than a kind of straight tectonic translation of cultural motifs. And then he would abstract these motifs in his geometry through lighting and shade effects. So a really good way of illustrating this is some of his preliminary drawings for some of the architectures that he did for the exposition that was happening along the West Coast. And here at the very bottom, we can see this papier-mâché and plaster temporary architectural form that was meant to serve as a kind of folie along the grotto, the artificial grotto that was produced there, and then establish a kind of colonnade for the stage, the theater that would happen behind this. But the way that he thought about these architectures was not in terms of its ornamental elements or even its structural idioms, but in terms of the contrast of light and shade that it produced. And he would study many different world cultures in this way, both through hardline, traditional assessments, but then in terms of the visual effects that they produced. And he did this as well with his select studies of Chinatown and his revivalist studies of chalet forms, Gothic forms, and other European architectural forms in a way that would allow him to combine them in his architectures. And we see some of the keys to this in Keeler's The Simple Home, where he talks about the importance of gabled roofs across the world, not only being susceptible to being constructed for climactic reasons, but actually for cultural and visual reasons. And he would create a kind of parallel understanding between the different typologies around the world, from Maori house typologies that were studied by Semper in his treatise Der Stil, to local ethnographic studies of Hawaiian housing typologies that he would parallel then in his own architectures. And so when we're looking at this architecture and we understand it through Maybeck's lens, it's really a kind of visual synthesis in terms of effects of non-Western and Western cultures in a way that allows him to make a singular expression of what whiteness is in this cultural space. And we can find and literally do tectonic analyses of this, both in visual and constructive means, to show where he's creating these parallels and where he's developing these syntheses. One of the most explicit examples of this can be found in the Williston Davis house, where he takes some of the stick-like configurations of the Hawaiian structures and the lanais found in that space and translates them into this particular kind of architectures. And so for me, what's interesting is that Maybeck's attempts to really think about Americanness and American character lend themselves to both cultural appropriation and the reification of the centrality of European identities, while leaving outside of this space any kind of benefit for the spatial and occupational uses of non-white figures. And in this sense, there's a kind of social and spatial maintenance in the notion of racial embodiment that Martin Alcoff and Sarah Ahmed discuss that is prevalent in his work. Thank you very much. I just wanted to make sure I can hand things over now to our second speaker, who I believe is Brian Norwood.
Hi. All right, I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So I am going to take my 10 minutes to talk about how we can use the history of the architectural profession to reframe architecture as we know it. Time is short, so I'm going to read. I'll be making a historiographic argument, but it turns on the history I'm writing in my first book, which examines the centrality of white Protestant nationalism to the formation of the architectural profession in the United States in the 1830s through 60s. So I want to begin these historiographical remarks with a pointed claim about the way critical education works that Fred Moten and Stefano Harney make in the University and the Undercommons. They write that, quote, critical education only attempts to perfect professional education. The professions constitute themselves in an opposition to the unregulated and the ignorant without acknowledging the unregulated, ignorant, unprofessional labor that goes on not opposite them, but within them. But if professional education ever slips in its labor, ever reveals its conditions of possibility to the professions it supports and reconstitutes, critical education is there to pick it up and to tell it, never mind, it was just a bad dream. So thinking about architecture, we can formulate this with some specificity. A constitutional act of the US architectural profession in the first half of the 19th century was to divide design and construction, to divide the professional intellectual pursuit of ideas and the unprofessional labor of building. This division was doggedly pursued through contracts, professional organizations, lectures, publications, and lawsuits. I'll call this division, seen here between the seated architect and standing construction labor, the architectural profession's original sin. The excluded ignorant and unprofessional has taken on many forms in architectural discourse and has often been ethno-nationalistically and racially defined through histories that divide what is and is not architecture. Sir Bannister Fletcher's famous tree, which has become a bit of a hobby horse as of late, is a great example. Fletcher positioned building that was not about ideas, or more accurately, not about or not a part of historically progressive ideation, as architecture's unprofessional periphery. But I want to back into an account of historiographical exclusion by taking a slightly different tact, one that the history of early 19th century US architects can illuminate. The most proximate unprofessionalism that these architects attempted to oppose their work to were craft laborers, often called mechanics. As the Philadelphian architect Thomas Eustick Walter lamented in his journal in 1835, "Oh, when shall the exalted and soul-inspiring science of architecture be free from quackery and from the baneful influence of mechanics. The New York architect, A.J. Davis, got up in front of an audience in 1841 and told them that good architecture was being prevented from emerging in New York because Americans kept conflating the artist and the artisan, the architect and the builder. In fact, he told them, quoting the English architect Sir John Soane, that it was ignorant, unskillful, and lazy craftsmen who were motivated only by money that kept ruining architects' artistic work. In a sense, this language is unsurprising in that it mimics the class dynamics of emerging proto-industrial capitalism. Architects started to resort to the professional title when it became useful to distinguish themselves from mere builders and the working class. But to return to Harney and Moten, this dynamic of the exclusion of the ignorant worked only by denying that it was within architecture. Professionalism worked by trying to exclude the non-professional that is actually within it. In a biographical sense, we can see this in the fact that in the early 19th century, a large number of architects came to the profession from the crafts, and they even formulated architecture in a kind of self-knowing relationship to them. So the architect here in this case is the carpenter that has become his own master. And we can also see this in the fact that a lot of work in architectural firms has often, at least structurally, not looked all that different from wage labor, as this 1930s satirical cartoon illustrated. So on the left, you see the architect looking for a job, on the right, what it's actually like to be doing it. But more fundamentally, the architectural profession was quite practically intertwined with construction labor that it tries to exclude. The paradox of reliance on construction labor while denying legal or ethical obligation to it, of course, has stuck with us today. To return to Harney and Moten, what I've done so far is to try to architecturally articulate the first half of their claim, that the profession took form in attempts to exclude or even oppose its own condition of possibility, construction labor. But let me now turn to the second half of their claim. While critical education, which takes place in theory and history classes in plenty of design studios, may often frame itself in opposition to practical professional education, it in fact completes it. Said bluntly, critical architectural education aids the segregation of design from construction labor that the profession doggedly pursued in its formation. Critical architectural discourse does not resist or critique this fundamental aspect of the profession's institutional form. It shores it up. When reliance on wage labor becomes apparent, and even worse, when racial capitalism's wholesale permeation of architecture as we know it, with dispossession and exploitation, is made visible, critical education looks for a way out. It displaces these conditions of possibility with conversations about other, grander ones. It leaps from a seat on the job site to a chaise lounge made of books on top of a pedestal gazing back through history. When I used the term original sin to describe the profession's break from building labor, the religiosity was deliberate. The early 19th century intellectual culture in which the US private practice profession emerged was thoroughly shaped by white Protestant nationalism. In fact, the dualistic division of building and architecture was formulated in the writings and lectures of a number of early American architects as a particular consequence of humanity's original sin in the Garden of Eden. Through grand discourse on world history, which formulated the conditions of possibility of architecture, not as proximate labor, but rather as religious and ethno-nationalistic ideals, architects found a way to decouple their profession's ethical grounds from the job site. Construction work was, of course, still necessary, but it was incidental to architectural meaning. History, thus, was architecture's theology, its systematic way of locating meaning and significance beyond the material world. This was often explicitly said. The Baltimorean architect Robert Carey Long Jr., for example, described architecture as a, quote, image of divine things in a lecture in New York in 1847. Architectural history, he said, could be discerned through what he called an architectonic ethnography, or an architecto-historic science that made visible, quote, the interior quality of a people, the character of their institutions, and the era of their existence. Architecture's conditions of possibility were resituated on the grandest order imaginable. So the theology that was explicit in early 19th century discourse largely became tacit over the 20th century. But the displacement of architecture's conditions of possibility from building labor to critical education, of course, maintained religious mystique. Architecture is rather like a theological exercise, Colin Rose said. So I'll conclude with 2 points. First, I'd suggest that attending to the institutionalization of the profession is a way to lay bare disciplinary discourses dissembling work. Architecture's professional institutions are born out of particular intellectual commitments and material conditions, and it is this professional framework that has given disciplinary discourse its shape. Critical discourse returns to the profession as a sort of salve, reassuring it that any unprofessional compromise is just a bad dream. To finish out the Colin Rowe quote about theology, while architecture may involve all sorts of sophisticated dialectic, he said, at the bottom, its foundation rests on the precariousness of fantasy and faith. Architecture's foundation is formulated here as quite literally immaterial. So second, to reckon with Harney and Moten's critique as architectural historians, I think we have to write histories of architecture that do not flinch in revealing the conditions of the architectural profession's possibility. We have to talk about labor. I did not mean this in the sense that we need to focus historical discourse around architectural practice as immaterial labor. This, I think, runs a real danger of reinforcing the original sin of the division of design and construction. Rather, we have to talk about class. We have to talk about the way the division of work and non-work is constructed. And we have to talk about how this construction creates the racialized edge conditions of capitalism. What we need are architectural histories that treat building labor in all its facets as the condition of possibility of architecture as we have come to know it. Thanks. And I'll turn it over to Caitlyn.
Thank you, Brian. All right, I'll share my screen here. And also just thank you to Mason and Mary Lou and everyone at U of T for organizing this panel. So today in my 10 minutes, I wanted to begin here on the road where Rainer Banham opened his article, Mountains of Modern Icons, the exhilarating experience of Kitt Peak, which was shared in advance of this talk. It's a strange road, Banham says, cutting for many miles across the desert until it begins to switch back up the mountains towards the Kitt Peak National Observatory, the modern icon of which he writes. Here it becomes purpose-built, sophisticated, engineered in the full flowering of the US Parkway art, I quote. The road, he writes, reveals its design superiority. Well, I'm going to talk about the telescopes of the Kitt Peak National Observatory and ultimately speak of Irocom Duog, the mountain on which the observatory stands. I want to start with the road and this assertion of superiority. Superior to what? To the banal straight line of the Arizona State Highway 86, off of which it forks, or to the traditional roads up the mountain created by the Tohono O'odham people, whose land Banham was in fact traversing. Even in the mid-20th century, Banham embraced this idea of a terra nullius America. An empty space of the American West and the infrastructure, such as the US highway system, that would bring white settlers, such as himself, there. There's an expansionist logic to modernism embedded in this position, which comes clearly into relief when we think about the telescope that is at the top of the road and the whole enterprise of space exploration that it's part of. And this modernist pursuit of scientific knowledge and of engineering cannot be disaggregated from the more terrestrial policies of expansion during the Cold War era. They are also symptomatic of a settler colonial architecture in North America. And here we see the telescope at the top. This is the solar telescope among an array of other telescopes. And another view there. So these telescopes then can't be, are symptomatic of settler colonial architecture in North America at mid-century when the state deployed large-scale scientific infrastructure projects and ventures as part of the military-industrial complex to acquire land from indigenous peoples and then to make that land useful or productive through the terms of the settler state. So I want to build on Charles and Brian's discussions of these imbrications of architecture, race, nationalism, and religion in the 19th century during this era of manifest destiny, this kind of push westward and an understanding kind of divine push towards the West and violent conquest. And then keep our eyes on architecture through the 20th century to understand how these same entanglements of whiteness, nationalism, and settler colonialism were articulated through mid-century up until the end of the 20th century. And so to begin to do this, I wanted to start with the land and kind of build up from there. And how land becomes acquired, these mechanisms through which it's acquired. So in 1958, the Tohono Nation, which was then called the Papago tribe, signed a lease with the National Science Foundation for 2,500 acres on the top of Irukam Duog, a sacred mountain in the Babo Kivari Range on the eastern side of the Tohono Nation. There, the NSF would build the first national astronomical observatory in the US. The land lease and the way that it turned land into an alienable commodity called property was a technique of settler colonial governance and one that architecture is built upon. So in the 20th century, settler colonialism did not proceed as it had in the 18th and 19th. Territory was not just taken from the Otham through invasion or government order, rather it was negotiated between two governments. However, the power relationships of those negotiations were extremely uneven, and the conditions under which they were made were shaped by this settler colonial past that as a result limited the agency of the Papago Tribal Council when they were going to agree to the terms of this lease. So to the astronomers, the peak was desirable because of its dry desert location and for the absence of infrastructure surrounding it, including even these roadways that Benham writes about. And this absence is reflected in the underdevelopment of the reservation, where only 6 of residents had electricity and many were just being connected to water and plumbing infrastructure. And it was to address issues of underfunding that the Papago tribe agreed to lease the mountaintop to the NSF soon after the site was surveyed. And here is the resolution approving that lease. So Papago chairman Mark Manuel wrote that it was a way for the tribal government to then raise revenue for projects on the reservation to kind of create economic opportunity locally. So within a settler framework of land use, the reservation was deemed underdeveloped. At the same time, tribal leadership were pressured into a position of seeing income from land leases as a path towards a future in which employment could be found in their own lands instead of off the reservation. And this is during the era of termination, where there was federal policies being passed trying to actually terminate reservations like the Papagos. And I'd like to connect then this purposeful disinvestment in indigenous lands and in infrastructures there that then resulted in the leasing of plots and parcels like the acreage atop Irocom Duog. And ideas of openness and emptiness that I earlier drew out of Banham's review of the telescope. This idea of emptiness, long a driver of settler expansion, was necessary for both astronomy and architecture. And I just want to acknowledge here that I'm building off the work of Jordy, who has written really beautifully about 18th century astronomy and settler colonialism as what she calls an imperialist planetarity. So emptiness figured as the dark night sky through which to see the stars, and the expansive desert against which the modern telescope would stand in sharp relief. And not only Banham was taken by the symbolic power of the solar telescope cutting obliquely across the sky. Designed by Myron Goldsmith of SOM, the telescope was also heralded as an American Stonehenge, a kind of hieroglyph, a letter, even called a tribute to a sun god in an article. So for all its highly precise engineering, the telescope was surrounded by a kind of mystical aura that I contend was a way to symbolically claim the mountain for a Western settler scientific culture. And this is something that Banham makes quite evident at the end of his article, where he states that to compare Otham relationships to the stars with those of the astronomers, which was something that came up in the land lease, would be to undervalue the telescope and its contribution. And he then hails the telescope as a supreme product of the culture to which I belong, the culture of scientific inquiry, technological expertise, and engineering precision, end quote. And I think the adulatory tones of this, and if you want to read the article, the quote goes on, adulatory tones of this racist paean to science, I think also really relates to these kind of insights about the theology and performativity of the architectural profession that we heard about in the previous two talks. But yet, while for the astronomers that surveyed Kitt Peak, or the architects who designed the telescope and the architectural critics who wrote about it, the Sonoran Desert where it is cited was an empty landscape to Tohono O'odham who lived there. It signifies intensively and extensively. And here is an image of the Babo Kivri Range taken from Irocom Duog. So on the 50th anniversary of the Kitt Peak National Observatory, Bernard Siqueiros, O'odham tribal member and director of the Himdog Key Cultural Center, gave a lecture at the observatory where he described the significance of Irocom Duog to the O'odham. We as O'odham, he says, like all people, have an explanation of our origins and beginnings. We have a creation story. Our creator is referred to as our elder brother or our teacher. His name is Itoy. And the reason why the Babo Kivari Range is so important to us is because the creator resides in those mountains. There's a place in those mountains we call Itoy Ki, which in our language means the home of Itoy or Itoy's house. In the lecture, Siqueiros goes on to describe the relationship of O'odham tribal members to the mountain, such as people returning after time away to reconnect to the land, or hunters like himself who have actually found water through reading the petroglyphs on the rocks. And so through this presentation, he kind of pushes back against this idea of a modern epistemology defining the mountain in the present versus an indigenous epistemology that can only define the mountain in the past. So something that used to be sacred but is now modern, by showing these kind of really contemporary and ongoing connections that bring of O'odham land use kind of continuing up through the present. And so then to kind of wrap up here, what I took away from reading this Banham article and then from learning about Irocom Duog is not just that Banham's theorization of infrastructure and architecture in the United States perpetuates a settler colonial ideology, but that's certainly true. But also it is because of this settler colonial ideology that the conversation around sites like the Solar Telescope can be such impoverished and superficial ones. This mountain is so much more than an observatory, as we see through Fiske talk. It's a relative, it's living, it signifies, it's a home. And so I wanted to end with this picture, which is just like something I found online. But I thought the caption was really nice because the way it frames Wagiluk, or the Babo Kivari Mountain, which is next to Irakom Duog, as the home of Itoy, or like the center of the universe. It's called Sunset at the Center of the Universe. So positioning really differently what the universe means than the universalizing claims of Western astronomy. All right, thank you. I'll stop sharing. And I guess turn it over to Mary Lou for the discussion.
Hello, hi. Thank you so much, Charles and Brian and Caitlyn, those astounding presentations. It's now time to have a conversation and to open it up to the floor. I wanted to say I lost the end of Brian's and the beginning of Caitlyn's. I was tossed offline, so I missed a part of the presentation. I'm sorry. Would and either of you, or if the three of you, have anything to say to begin with, or shall I turn it over and begin asking questions? So I could say that I was very happy to hear Sarah Ahmed's name, and also Fred Moten and the Banham re-looking through the text. It just hit me, and I began thinking about that very, very important piece by Sarah on phenomenology of whiteness, and she's trying to work around how we can begin to, and it's from the early 90s, that piece, it's in feminist theory, and it's how to not reify this whiteness and see what it does, but actually, no, not, I gotta get this straight, rather than what we are doing or people working on history and theory are doing with it to be explanatory, but how to see how it acts, and then how do we bring it into education and figure out how it acts on bodies. That was my general entry. There were materials, theology came up, performativity in Charles, and again in Brian's, and then again the landscape, the land, which can be a claim, which goes back to the one thing I was reading, I saw in your presentation, Charles, on wood, the romance almost of wood in these interiors also. So I wonder if anyone wants to speak before we go into the questions on how does it not become reified as we pursue critical education, not another additional thing, the wrong focus. Is that?
Mm-hmm. No, I think for me, that's a really great question. I was also thinking about listening to Brian and Caitlyn's presentations, that not only do we not want to reify the wrong things, but that the framing of our discourse imposes a kind of poverty that prevents us from doing more than reification. So in some ways, I'm trying to argue that the discipline of architecture almost forces us to become cultural appropriators. Like it strips all of the meaningful elements of what comes along with an architectural form, so that it can be abstracted and integrated into the system of form making that we have. And that very process itself, kind of, it polices us from diving too deeply and keeps us in a state of poverty. And it struck me, as I'm both in listening to and participating in multiple forums like this one, that part of what it is that's most meaningful that we're able to give architects is a new vocabulary and a new self-awareness of the lack of vocabulary that they have in comparison to other disciplines and other discourses. And so for me, I really love these two papers, and they help to complement the multiple ways around which a settler colonial frame, compels us to think differently about what architecture can do.
I don't think I have a full thought on all of it, but the way Ahmed begins that article is she says, you know, she starts with this problem of reification and the worry about it, right? And she says reification, she says the reason we can talk about whiteness is that reification is not something we do to whiteness, but rather something that whiteness does. And I think a lot about that kind of in the way Charles is talking about the profession here just now, in the sense that it's a thing, whiteness is the thing that creates the problem, the inability to get out and have these other conversations, rather than it being the product of the conversations. It is the framing device.
Yeah, I mean, and I would just add to that, you know, I was really enjoyed hearing kind of Brian's discussion of the profession itself and sort of how, you know, whiteness is so central to this very kind of narrow definition of architecture and of its professionalization. That is the thing that kind of really creates these confines through which we can then start to speak about, you know, what it is that we think that we can speak about. And so, you know, while on the one hand, broadening, you know, what we talk about when we talk about architecture, but also how we kind of think about the architect then within it and who that, you know, architect is.
Absolutely, good point. It brings up, maybe also brings together Brian talking about criticality, critical theory. And it's something I've been obsessed with in the last while, trying to write on what happened with critical theory as it comes in after Colin Rowe, but with, you know, people operating now are significant to what was left out of that. How did they define and bracket? Remember being told to bracket as you thought? There were all these parts of thinking that went into, well, if I use reification again, that are rather complicit with within architecture schools and hierarchies within architecture schools, if not the profession.
Yeah, I was looking for the line in Harney and Moten's undercommons about bracketing. Let's see. So they're challenging. This is towards the end of the essay. They're challenging us to think about how one might get out of this kind of closed loop of the university and professions reinforcing one another. They say, what would be outside of this act of the conquest circle? What kind of ghostly labored worlds escape in this circling act? An act like a kind of broken phenomenology where the brackets never come off, and what is experienced as knowledge is an absolute horizon of knowledge whose name is spanned. So they go on that, but I think that kind of question of critical theory, putting certain brackets on to actually, or, you know, Tafori would say the parentheses that allowed us to ignore these other conditions and convince ourselves we're operating on architecture, capital A architecture, in some kind of isolated space. Is something that actually reinforces decisions that were made in the 19th century, or reinforces kind of movements that go back to the 15th century, for example. So yeah, I mean, I think their question of like, what would critical theory that's not constrained by institutions that have defined what critical theory is look like is a tough open question. But I think it maybe goes a bit to what Charles was suggesting at first, the question of like how we find new vocabularies to talk about this thing called architecture.
Do you have new vocabularies, Charles?
Well, I will address that, but I do want to sort of put a pin in the challenge that I think is implicit in Brian's paper, which is literally to be very self-aware of the way that we currently define architecture, and that this doesn't have to be the way that we need to define it. That as a profession and with a cadre of professional schools, that the purview of the professional architect, as opposed to what gets built in the built environment and how people understand what that means, you know, is very selective. You know, it's almost like we've cherry picked some of the best parts to make a particular kind of of disciplinary culture. But we could easily reformulate that, and we could easily bring other parts in and leave other parts out, particularly if we find that the way that this discourse frames our discussion and frames our understanding of history is a bit too Eurocentric, or it's a bit too exclusive in terms of the populations that we want to open things up to. And to me, I think that's a much more productive conversation than the one that we tend to have, which is about sort of how many people do we license, and can we sort of diversify the body of exclusive makers, as opposed to, can we change who we think of as makers to start with? Maybe there are already people who are consecrated, who are doing things in the built environment that don't fit our current model of professional practice, but could open that way up. And I think if we do that, then we naturally start to look for other critical vocabularies. I think then that the ways that these makers start to think about the creation of their spaces give us clues as to what that should be. But to me, I think this is like, I wonder if this is a sort of parallel moment of, and I won't call it a crisis, but I guess contemplation of sort of, what was imposed upon many by the autonomy debates. Like, is there something within architecture that, some kind of knowledge base or some kind of system that is unique to what the architect does? And I think, we're asking the inverse question, the complementary question, which is, well, what is it about the built environment that we can learn from others that we've ignored for so long because we've been so focused on building monuments and certain types of signature forms? And I think if that is a different starting point, then I think we can go many different places instead.
Caitlyn?
Oh yeah, and to add to that, I really like what Charles has just been saying about, also thinking of, other practices of making, not only other vocabularies, but I think also these kind of practices of ongoing kind of care and maintenance. That's been something I've been thinking a lot about in the example, the case that I was talking about, like also like care of the landscape, care of a relationship to a place, and how do these kind of more like enduring and longer relationships and practices, how do those change how we think about architecture, which is thought of always as this like act of construction.
Mason has said that we have 5 to 10 minutes for opening up to discussion. So if we should do that and give some opportunity. Mason, do you want to take it away?
Sure. We've got some questions in the Q&A. I wanted to pick up on something, though, if I might, Mary Lou, first. Thank you, Charles, Brian, and Caitlyn, for fantastic talks, very concise, which is an art in and of itself, is to get to the point. I was really inspired by a thread between the three around the idea of appropriation. I think, Caitlyn, this idea of appropriating a landscape, appropriating a mountain, Brian, in some way, the appropriation of labor. And Charles, I think a longstanding, as evidenced by your publications, in particular, Building Character. I know it's a recent book of yours, and congratulations, by the way, on your award you received recently for it. This idea of what you called the mining cultures for emotional affects, and thinking about this idea of character. I know you write a lot about in that book about character, maybe almost as metaphor. I'm wondering what the three of you might think, fast forwarding from 19th century and early 20th century to notions of postmodernity as forms of appropriation. And do you see parallels within contemporary modes of appropriation as a form of, borrowing from Charles here, mining cultures for emotional affects, rather than for a response to non-white occupants, non-white users? Is there a thread, you think, between this notion of appropriation and metaphor, which is often promoted in studio setting, in architectural education, this idea of mining for metaphors? is there something we could see within that? And I think the powerful thread about appropriation through your talks.
I mean, I can just say something quickly in relationship to what it is that you're saying, both in the sort of long 19th century time period, but also in terms of the longer trajectory. But I'm slowly starting to develop this perspective that even when we borrow from European cultures, using a European idiom, that we're still appropriating. That is that we need to abstract it in a way that somehow makes it uncanny in its regular context, so that the architect can then use it as a kind of fragment. And so for me, this conversation of the postmodern fragment and the belief that somehow the language of communication and the basis of communication was what had been deteriorated through the sense of critical discourses, for me, I think was just another conceptual technology to allow for the kind of borrowing that's been consistent throughout architecture. So when I look back at the École des Beaux-Arts and I look at the role of historical precedent there, to me, that was the beginning of the kind of cultural appropriation, a system of that. And I kind of wonder if the power of metaphor and the power of design that we tend to have doesn't always come with a bit of that violence. And it isn't a kind of a legitimizing of the central Eurocentric gaze that we have to have. So for me, it's always sort of controlled by the need for the architect, from whatever cultural background, to be using a kind of Eurocentric cultural pedigree in an assimilationist vein, to be thinking about the world through that lens. And if we give up that lens, I think maybe then something else besides cultural appropriation might emerge. And in addition, I think there are some really good architectural models of practice where they anchor themselves in a community and they work for that community as opposed to just everywhere. And I think that those things tend to push against this notion that you're discussing.
Brian, Caitlyn, do you want to comment, or shall I go to the Q&A?
Yeah, I mean, I would just really briefly say that also thinking through the early 19th century, because that's kind of where I'm stuck at the moment, that this, the kind of style debates over classicism were incredibly intense in the 1830s to 60s. And there's a whole lot of name calling and insulting between architects going on around whether someone's a classicist or an eclecticist, or and I think what's really interesting is that lots of architects in the US are falling into different camps, and they're taking different positions on how architecture should appear. But what's assumed that underlies all of that is that conversation can be had, and that conversation can be had in a way that all the architects can communicate with one another, and also have this conversation in a way where they believe they have control over the kind of way architecture communicates. So I think in a sense, what I'd want to say is like the discourse on style in the early 19th century amongst architects was something that was enabled by an institutionalization of a practice that saw that as the domain that it had control over and that it could do the most through. And I think maybe that's where it becomes really interesting as a way to ask questions about studio pedagogy, not only in terms of like, are we culturally appropriating or not, but to maybe ask like, what kind of decisions have put us in a situation where we would even have that debate, like where that would be where the moral valence of working as an architect gets set. So that's why I think like thinking about the kind of institutional roots in the 19th century might help us reframe those sort of questions slightly.
Yeah, I mean, just quickly, I was thinking as you were asking about, postmodernism, that the article that I shared is written in 1984. So it's like appropriating this this historical moment of, 25 years prior, appropriating kind of that appropriation. So I was also just thinking about, and this sort of nostalgia, I think then in Banham for the modernism of that time of also kind of what, what is at the root of these appropriations, and like in these, what's getting displaced within them, and what is that symptomatic of? I think that's just kind of really interesting to trace as I'm sort of thinking more about that.
Great, thank you so much. We've got some questions popping up in the Q&A feature, so and we've got another 15 or so minutes, so please keep that going, and let's keep this great conversation going, please. We have a question actually from Professor Anna Maria Leon, who actually will be joining us March 11th for a parallel related event. First, she says, "Dear Charles, Brian, and Caitlyn, thank you for these fantastic talks. It's great to catch up on your work, and thank you, Mary Lou, for organizing and moderating." So first, some fan mail. My question is to the choice of, quote, "the Americas" in the title of this roundtable. I wanted to prompt you to reflect on what might motivate this choice in a roundtable of papers about the United States or its territory, and on the role of the Americas, or America, how it is known in other parts of the region, in today's conversation. Thank you. Maybe do one of you want to start with a response to that?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really great challenge. I'll sort of try and take the prompt since I'm the one who came up with the title. But in some ways, it was something that I struggled with in terms of trying to balance a kind of transnational understanding of geopolitics, and also a kind of a more historically critical understanding of what we mean by America, the Americas, in terms of being geopolitical boundaries, but also cultural spaces. So in that sense, I think, at least in our focused discussion of the United States and parts of North America, that involves some of the discussions of indigenous migrations across the Bering Strait into the US before it becomes this kind of settler colonial space and that vacated history. As well as, for me, from my perspective, some of the ways that people like Ariella Azoulay talk about the potential histories of a place that get vacated by a hegemonic history. So histories of Chinese America and histories of African America and other spaces that could have been much more central to our story if it were not for the manifest destiny element. But I think, at least from my perspective, the more central term for the title, in terms of what I wanted to emphasize, was not the Americas, which could easily cover that range if we're talking about transnational connections. I'm trying to talk about the Asia Pacific. There are other references there. But for me, revisionist, I think, becomes really, really crucial. And for me, it was really about the audience and trying to use the critical assumptions of the architect and the professional architect, which is very Eurocentric, which tends to privilege the United States as a space, almost an exceptional space. This space where European colonialism doesn't operate in the same ways, and we have a different kind of racism that's moving toward a kind of perfectibility of the liberal democracy, which I think is part of the mythology that we need to get over in order to be able to see the Americas in this geographical context. So it wasn't that it wasn't a sort of central element for me in my discussion, but for me, it's always a question of how do you build a bridge between what it is that the architect knows and believes and kind of honors currently to this broader kind of discussion. And so we could have easily introduced case studies from Central America, South America, other forms of Americas, as well as brought into higher relief some of the debates about what was America. For me, like in this moment of, is it a continental nation or is it an imperial power? And if so, how do you substantiate that? And then does that bring us closer to the critique of the US as a kind of colony, a settler colony, in the same ways that spaces in Central America and South America were? But in order for us to, at least in my belief, in order for us to get to that legibility of terms, I think that we have to start with a critique of the center that tends to hold the imagination of the architect and then work our ways out. So to me, it's a really profound challenge, because I think that there's lots of literatures the architect could benefit from if they realize that just a tweaking of the frame opens up those kinds of horizons. And I know that like there's a critique to be made about always focusing on the US, always focusing on the European diaspora in that sense, but I almost feel like that's necessitated by our disciplinary history. But I am open to seeing other models of how one, deconstructs that reality. So as you say, she'll present later in the semester. I'll definitely want to see how she broaches that question.
Absolutely. That's on March 11th. Charles, I hope you get to join and put your own question in the Q&A to her. Caitlin, I think you had your hand up there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's such a good and important question. And I was also sort of thinking about this in a couple kind of unresolved ways. And I mean, one, to kind of pick up on Charles, and this idea of the multiplicity, like the many nations, within America, I think can like point to this plurality of Americas. But I was also thinking, in the Tohono O'odham Nation, which is the land that I was talking about, is, it's a tribal nation that's on the US-Mexico border. And I think that in my discussion, I really kind of don't even bring that up, because I think the regimes in which land and people are treated through settler colonialism is so different kind of on both sides, on like the different sides of the border. So, I mean, I think that it's just something that we should really keep in mind, because I think that, there's so many kind of tensions in thinking about, what does it mean to think about the Americas as a kind of, as one space or as really different spaces. And I was also thinking about this as, Charles was showing kind of Maybeck's work in Hawaii, which, like, what does it mean that we're talking about the Americas when Hawaii is like, it's in the Pacific, it's part of a Pacific geography and relations between different islands, and maybe we kind of need to revise our understanding of the Americas to, understand kind of that imperialist geography a little bit. So, so thank you for the question, Anna Maria.
Yeah, I also think that Jonathan Massey has a good question that's a follow-up to that, which is, how do you then present a history of the Americas in a way that is critical in that sense? And in some ways, I think this is the question, right? Like how can we go back and revisit what it is that we've institutionalized and inherited? And for me, there are probably, hundreds of ways, right? Let me just acknowledge that, right? But for me, what I think is really very fruitful is kind of choosing one thread to pull on and then seeing where that takes us, both in the sense of critiquing the dominant whiteness of our field so that we can understand sort of how it controls how we discuss things. But I also think that that's a kind of like, it's a sieve. It's a way of saying, what do we need to keep versus what do we need to sort of leave behind? And if we can do that in a rigorous way, we're already remaking American history. We'll be critiquing the kind of settler colonial elements of that. But I think the other test is to sort of, how do we then incorporate the voices of peoples who've been ignored? And so for me, like, the indigenous question becomes really very key. And I mentioned and wrote in the description about Vincent Scully, who tried really hard to do this. He tried to sort of create a parallel study between the pre-Columbian architectures and the kind of verticality of that with the verticality of the American skyscraper, to talk about them as both sort of spiritual references to the landscape and the way that man in his creation and ordering of the universe and the built environment tries to construct a kind of, a sense of architecture that's both vertical and horizontal in its scope. And I think that conceptual lens is really interesting. I feel like he had to invent it in order to write them into this story. But he didn't sort of critique the settler colonial element. He sort of took it as given and tried to bring them in. But there are probably other ways of doing so that I think becomes a really interesting experiment. So for me, I think, I would answer that question in terms of strategy and points of engagement, as opposed to like, I have it all figured out and I know what the narrative is, because I don't think I do just quite yet. I think that's probably the work of a generation.
Mary Lou?
I agree on that. It's hard to find the words, you say framework, it's a survey course or whatever, but we don't want to backtrack into additive well, here's a survey and I put in place this in, or I change a set of theoretical readings so that they get a different, it seems like it's going to be a long time and constantly under revision. And we're all within it. I mean, educated within white supremacy. So like, how do we get beyond that educational framework that we bring to the table already? And I did wonder, like, do we do the tight analyses, such as you're doing, Charles, with specific people, architects? And then how does that come back again into a broader framework that can be brought into, if not a framework, a broader sensibility and criticality to architectural history? And I think we saw it today with the three of you together, how the possibilities do exist for that. There are other questions we should get.
Yeah, we've got time probably for certainly one or two more. And Charles, thank you for segueing to Jonathan's fantastic question in there around frameworks and pedagogy. And naturally 10 minutes would never do justice to a conversation like that, but good to slip some of it in. There's a question from Jason Nguyen, a professor here at University of Toronto, Daniels faculty. He has a broad question. I would be interested to hear the panelists parse race as subject in architectural history versus race as methodology in architectural history. And further unpacking what race as method is it anthropological, political, etc.? I wonder how race as method can help break down certain categories such as architecture versus building or architect versus builder. I also presume race as method might provide a way to analyze architecture in periods before the modern theorizations of race, such as colorism, etc. This might, I wonder if all of you might have thoughts on it, but I'm thinking maybe in particular of Brian here, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, these are all these questions that have come in are good ones, and Maria is good at making me feel very uncomfortable about giving a question that I don't know an answer to yet. So thank you for that. So I would say, let's see if I can say something and make a transition to an answer to Jason's question. So I took the second half of my presentation title, Architecture as We Know It, from a recent article by Fernando Lara called The American Mirror, something in Architecture as We Know It. I think the creation of architecture as we know it. And I think that phrase is so useful and I hope that I consistently use it in my teaching more to emphasize the kind of constructedness and contingency of this practice, of this profession, of this thing that we call architecture. And I think in a way that might go part of the way to kind of Charles's focus on the use of the word revisionist, that there's something here about needing to do the work of taking apart the kind of destructive method that has to parallel also the kind of reconstructive practices where we're finding other new things to talk about. So the way I think into to Jason's question, I think in particular is this, I would say is racial capitalism. And I've been working through a lot of the literature on racial capitalism over the last year or so and teaching on it right now. And I think the kind of emphasis of the framework of racial capitalism on the idea that capitalism necessitates inequality. Capitalism necessitates kind of means of differentiating, and racism is the way that has played out, at least in, as we think in the kind of Atlantic world context, where this kind of theorization is born out of. And I think that emphasis on differentiation as something that's fluid, that is constantly shifting, the differentiation of class, of ethnicity, of religion, of gender, all those things playing out through a lens that race becomes a way of kind of homogenizing some of those techniques of differentiation, gives us a way into thinking about racial thinking as a methodological problem rather than something that we reify, to go back to an earlier conversation, and think that the solution to kind of the solution to white supremacy or racism in architecture is to simply start talking about races, or to talk about difference in a way that maybe some of DEI frameworks kind of push us, that what racial capitalism, I think, pushes on is that it's all the kind of divisive, the ways differentiation occurs and the kind of edge conditions in that differentiating space that matter a lot. So this is where we can start talking about work versus non-work, informal economies, and we can start tying a discussion about architecture and labor, I think, very concretely into a discussion about how racialization works. I mean, the other term I would put out there is racecraft that Barbara and Karen Fields talk a lot about. We have to think of it as something that's actively happening in different ways.
And I know that we're like tight on time, so I'll just say very quickly that within this question is also the difficulty of periodization. And I think, again, someone like Azule is really useful in that, she challenged this idea of, especially within modernist studies, of being object-oriented in the way that we understand things, as opposed to understanding the continuity of political strategies for conquest, division, for organizing the environment. And to me, race operates in that way, very uniquely in architectural discourse, in that it distorts our view of the past. So even if we wanted to go back and get a kind of pure, archaeological, ethnographic understanding of what that meant, there's so many filters that we're carrying with us that I think we'd have to do the deconstructing of our, this necessity to separate the pre-modern and the modern in order to really understand what that would mean historically. But again, I think it's a rich space within which to happen. And I think there's even a space for the designer to do such, and in deconstructing some of the assumptions that Mary Lou mentioned, Colin Rowe and some others that we bring with us that we tend to not think about. They just tend to be givens. If we question them, I think then that provides a space for another strategy.
And yeah, just seeing that we only have a couple of minutes. I mean, one thing to add just really quickly is I think in this great question, the kind of in the sort of the breaking down of categories and of periodization and stuff, I think some of the work that this kind of races method can do is also allow us to think kind of intersectionally at race and gender. A lot of what I've been thinking of is the kind of like the who and the what counts is so much dictated along these really entangled lines of race and gender, and of how practices outside of white European architecture are often not seen as architecture because of the intersection of both of those questions. So yeah, thank you.
We'll be abruptly cut off soon. I have to thank everyone, and we're not going to get to the questions. If I have a second, it's like, if I track land, I think if tracking land, you track bodies and then you get to architecture later. Like, it's like flipping, as Charles was saying, from the object. If you start tracking through another way, you come to the bodies, then to subject, then to, it's just a method I've been trying to figure out myself. Anyhow, I really want to thank you all. This was really inspiring. Thank you all very much. And for the guests, and I'm sorry for those questions we didn't get to, joining us for this special conversation. And thank you, Charles, for putting so much effort into bringing Caitlyn and Brian to the virtual table, for us having invited them and putting together this. I want to thank everyone who's attended, and Mason for helping with the vet the questions and moderate. So we have 1 minute left. Please join us for our next events I'm supposed to announce. It's in forestry, and it's forest management planning data analysis challenges in the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence forest regions. That'll be another part of our